The Korean War began as a battle between North Korea and South Korea. The South Korean military quickly collapsed, and the war entered a new phase. The United States decided to provide support to South Korea and called on the United Nations to convene a Security Council. At the time, the Soviet Union was boycotting Security Council meetings. As a result, the Soviet Union was unable to veto the U.S. proposal. As a result, the Security Council was led by the United States, and the United Nations decided to provide assistance to South Korea. Thus, the structure of the war changed dramatically, from North Korea versus South Korea to North Korea versus the United Nations. Following this turn of events in the Korean War, the United States gradually clarified its position as a nation. Asia became the front line of the Cold War between East and West. Japan has great strategic value. We should make peace with Japan as soon as possible. And we should bring Japan into the Western camp. The United States has once again come to think this strongly. On the other hand, the United States also felt a sense of crisis that if it made peace with Japan, it might no longer be able to use its bases within Japan. Therefore, even after making peace with Japan, the United States became more eager than ever to be able to use its bases within Japan. Japan also began to clarify its position as a nation in the wake of the Korean War. At that time, the Japanese government's thinking was as follows. Communist and democratic forces each have their own idea of peace. But peace for the communist forces can only be achieved by destroying the peace of the democratic forces. Thus, the communist forces launched a war of aggression against the democratic forces. In response, the United States and the United Nations stepped up to protect the peace of democratic forces. Based on this recognition, Japan decided to cooperate with the United Nations forces. A policy was officially decided to build a peaceful and democratic Japan under the security of the United Nations. This was also one answer to the question Japan faced: what is the logic behind having U.S. troops stationed in Japan? Let's say that in order to maintain world peace, Japan adopts a policy of providing bases to the United Nations. In that case, Japan believed it would be able to maintain its international legitimacy and ultimately allow the U.S. military to be stationed in Japan. In this way, Japan further strengthened its support for the United Nations. The United States had already decided to secure as much of what it could procure in Japan as possible. Therefore, maintenance of landmines, military vehicles, and weapons was requested from Japan. Under these circumstances, as it began to be expected that the war would continue for a long time, requests like this increased even more. Specifically, Japan was requested to provide goods such as car parts, trucks, coal, and gunny bags, as well as services such as vehicle and ship repairs. In this way, the United Nations forces began to place various orders with Japan. Japan was required to respond to the global situation, namely the Korean War. Furthermore, the production of military supplies, which had been banned in Japan after the war, began to effectively resume in the form of orders from the U.S. military. All of these transactions were paid in U.S. dollars. This was a great boon for Japan, as the country was suffering from a serious shortage of U.S. dollars at the time. In this way, the Korean War gave the Japanese economy, which had been on the brink of death, a new lease of life, and it was finally able to get back on track. Meanwhile, GHQ felt a sense of crisis about these changes in the global situation. Communist forces are gaining strength. We must suppress the communist forces within Japan. They reinforced this idea even further. So GHQ turned its attention to the labor movement. At that time, the leading force in the labor movement was the Sanbetsu, which was heavily influenced by the Communist Party. However, the Red Purge effectively forced the Sanbetsu to disband. With the labor movement losing its leadership, GHQ provided support mainly to labor unions and government agencies that were opposed to the Communist Party. As a result, the Japan General Council of Trade Unions, or SOHIO, was formed. The Japan General Council of Trade Unions was a huge organization, with 2.76 million members at the time of its inception. As a result, this organization gradually came to take the lead in the labor movement. However, although the organization was founded with anti-communist aims, it soon shifted significantly to the left and began to align itself with the Japan Socialist Party. They then adopted the 4 principles of peace advocated by the Japan Socialist Party: complete peace, maintaining neutrality, opposition to military bases, and opposition to rearmament, as their campaign policy. In other words, they began to make their opposition to the United States clear. Let's return to the Korean Peninsula. As the North Korea army advanced south, the United Nations forces were cornered around Busan. As a result, many of South Korea's airfields became unusable. This put serious constraints on United Nations forces' air operations. As a result, the airfields around Kyushu, close to the Korean peninsula, rapidly became increasingly important. Many aircraft began to fly to the Korean peninsula from airfields in Kyushu. This trend was also seen in maritime transport. Sasebo, which developed as a military port for the former Japanese Navy, aimed to transform into a trading port after the war. However, with the outbreak of the Korean War, most of these important areas were once again taken over by the U.S. military. Thus, Sasebo once again played the role of a military port, and freight trains loaded with military supplies arrived there every day. From there, large quantities of supplies were transported to Busan. Thus, in order to break the deadlock in the war, the United Nations forces launched the Incheon landing operation. During this operation, ports throughout Japan were used as bases for United Nations forces. Many warships left Japanese ports and headed for the Korean peninsula. Japan also cooperated with the United Nations forces in terms of information. This is because Japan once ruled the Korean peninsula, and there were many Japanese people who were familiar with the terrain and port conditions around Incheon. This information was utilized, and the Incheon landing operation was a great success. This operation prompted the United Nations forces to launch a counterattack, gradually pushing back the North Korea forces. The front line then crossed the 38th parallel north and approached the Chinese border. In response, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army entered the Korean War, further prolonging and intensifying the conflict. As a result, the United States had to further deploy its military forces on the Korean peninsula and lost the military power to defend Japan. Therefore, the United States argued that Japan itself must rearm. As a condition for peace, Japan was required to rearm. So what did the Japanese people think about it at the time? Faced with the reality that war was taking place just across the sea, many Japanese felt deep anxiety about the future. If the Korean War develops into a larger-scale war, what position will Japan, which has renounced military armaments under its constitution, be placed in? The problem was no longer hypothetical but was now considered a real problem. As a result, the ideal of a complete peace was deemed impossible. Then, opinions that sought a separate peace treaty, which was considered realistic, gradually gained the upper hand. Thus, Japan began to aim for a separate peace treaty that would be concluded only with Western countries. At the same time, they also aimed to conclude a security treaty that would allow the United States to use bases in Japan even after the peace treaty was signed. The United States shared the same views as Japan on these 2 points. The issue was the new condition the United States had added, Japan's rearmament. Negotiations between the 2 countries have been slow to reach an agreement on this new issue. John Foster Dulles argued, "We want to know whether Japan has any intention to rearm. Japan should also contribute to the common defense. To achieve this, constitutional reform is essential." In response, Shigeru Yoshida said, "Japan has not yet recovered enough national strength to rearm. It could also lead to a return of militarism in Japan. Neither Japan nor the international community would understand this." Thus, he continued to avoid giving a clear answer, citing various reasons. However, Japan was in a position where it could not completely ignore the opinions of the United States. Therefore, the Japanese government tried to resolve the situation for the time being by making concessions on several points. First, it was proposed that U.S. troops be allowed to remain stationed in Japan even after the peace treaty was signed. It also proposed strengthening the National Police Reserve and the Coast Guard, and establishing a Ministry of Public Security to oversee them. In this way, the Japanese government avoided clearly acknowledging rearmament, while deflecting pressure from the United States by expanding its security apparatus. As the peace negotiations progressed, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was thinking the following. It was, Japan will provide bases to the United Nations in order to maintain world peace. However, Shigeru Yoshida was not entirely convinced. The reason the United Nations was able to respond quickly during the Korean War was because of the unique circumstances of the U.S. military being stationed in Japan. Even if Japan were to be attacked in the future, it was not certain that such an environment would be in place. Therefore, Shigeru Yoshida believed that Japan should receive direct defense guarantees from the United States. He also thought, suppose Japan provided its bases to the United Nations instead of the United States. In that case, the United States may permanently refuse to return the occupied Okinawa and Ogasawara Islands to Japan, citing their strategic importance. Based on this judgment, he chose the United States rather than the United Nations to provide the base. Meanwhile, the war situation on the Korean Peninsula was changing rapidly. The United Nations forces were once pushed back from the 38th parallel and lost Seoul, but they counterattacked again and recaptured it. Then they headed north again and reclaimed the 38th parallel. In response to this situation, President Truman thought, if this war continues any longer, the Soviet Union may enter the conflict. If that happens, this war could develop into World War III. Therefore, he avoided escalating the war. However, Douglas MacArthur, who was in command on the ground, strongly opposed this policy. Asia is the main battlefield in the fight against communism. If we lose in Asia, we lose freedom and peace. We should bomb mainland China and send in Nationalist Party troops from Taiwan. He argued as follows. Thus, President Truman, who wanted to avoid expanding the war, and Douglas MacArthur, who advocated for an all-out war, came into conflict. As a result, Douglas MacArthur was eventually relieved of his command by the President of the United States. This news came as a great shock to Japanese society, which had been ruled by Douglas MacArthur since the end of the war. The next day, the newspapers reported Douglas MacArthur dismissal on the front page. Douglas MacArthur General was the most understanding and good leader for post-war Japan. We regret his dismissal as he is a benefactor of Japan's revival. This opinion spread throughout Japan. Many Japanese people lined the road to see Douglas MacArthur off as he returned to Japan from Haneda Airport, bidding him farewell. This event gave many people a strong sense that the Japanese occupation was about to end.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point. The hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. Like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that. Goodbye.